So good afternoon, everybody. Lala, would you like to introduce our guests?
Yes, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everybody. We are here again, and we are more than happy to share with you all again with our featured guest from Universitas Negeri Malang, or UM. And Anya Lion is here, my mentor, my best mentor. Anya Lion is here, and we have Professor Zulayati Rohmah. Assalamualaikum, Ibu. We have Dr. Anik. Assalamualaikum Bu, and Assalamualaikum Prof Yazid, also my mentor while I was doing my PhD in Australia. And we also have here Ibu Dr. Maharani. Selamat siang, good afternoon. So today we are going to talk about uh, TESOL research and mentoring. And I believe that this is a very interesting topic to talk about. So everyone can share their insights on probably the best practices here. Anya, the show is yours again.
Thank you so much, Lala, for introducing your colleagues, of whom a lot you know so personally and you have worked with. So so have I actually. So anyway, I would like to continue today with a subject of research trends, but now I would like to take a bit different take on it, and I would like us to discuss trends and research and concepts from the perspective of research mentoring and supervision. They two a bit different, nonetheless. So that's why I'm mentioning them both. So this is our old slide that we've been running with, basically from pedagogy, the way I teach and I do research. I obviously make the students central. I'm sure that a lot of people have different diagrams, and student is not central, theory is central for different reasons, and maybe it works for them for the purposes for which they have the frameworks. So we've collected quite a large team today for the reason that I was sent this book by Professor Basthomi a few months ago. However, as you see, we've been pretty busy with life and also with lots of podcasts. So we took time to read it and look through it. And I thought it was time, as we are discussing research, to talk about supervision, which was the subject of Professor Basthomi's, Professor Rohmah, and Dr. Anik's chapter. So I just posted here the picture of it, and UP, I can't read, I'm too old. Anyway, you can see who edited this, and you can come back to this particular page. So the title of the chapter that our colleagues have edited is in here, Teachers' Perspectives on Learner Autonomy and Learning Strategies. I feel it wasn't teachers, it was lecturers or mentors, wouldn't they? Or teachers' perspectives. Anyway, so at least one more step, please, implications of the gap. But because the top title is the book, and the at least one more step, please, implications of the gap. Right, so everybody who's done research already knows more or less the gap. We go, oh my goodness, one more step. Yeah, there's something to be done before we actually talk about what other teachers think. So I have prepared my own set of questions that I have for our colleagues. However, I don't have to, because we're so crowded today, I don't have to actually have them visible all the time. Hello, Professor Andrew Lyon. Thank you for visiting us. So our home team is just about full. We have some people on vacation. So anyway, I know how I would like to start, but maybe I might, before I take over, I would like to hear from our colleagues from Indonesia about an issue that I would like to raise urgently. Maybe you came to this podcast with something on your mind that you think if we don't address it, time will be wasted. So would you like to say something that you find urgent? Professor Basthomi, take the lead. We always send men first to face the danger, and then the rest of us. We can't hear you. You probably are on mute. No. Okay.
We cannot hear you, Pak Yazid.
Okay.
You're even quieter than I am.
Okay, Dr. Anik, you take over, and maybe Professor Basthomi can somehow sort out his
Sure.
audio. I don't know how to do it.
Yeah. Thank you.
You don't need to have headphones. You can just talk to the computer if you can. So, Dr.
Yes.
Anik.
Yes. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Yeah. Well, talking about mentoring is actually just like what being mentioned previously in the book. Long time ago, we were actually on the same cohort. Long time ago. Professor Yazid Basthomi and Professor Rohmah actually are on the same cohort at that time. And we did asked by, of course, to write down our undergraduate thesis. But now, if we read back, actually, we do not know which part that can be published, and we think that it is not publishable because we do not know the research gap and how it may contribute to the field of our study. At that time, we just write. We were being asked to write down. We write down the introduction and the methodology, and I thought that's it. We do not know what to do. But during the course of our study, later on, in the master's degree and also doctorate degree, we know that we should be able to provide contribution to the field. And that's what we learned later on, that we don't want to repeat the same mistake that we had in the past for our future students and our current students. And I believe Yazid and Bu Zuliafi would also had a similar idea about that, and they may have some additional information about the things why we need to do some mentoring to our students, and then also encourage them to be able to contribute to the field of our study. That's what I can say, Dr. Anita.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. Yes. So let us explain a little bit what we're talking about, because I think that is anyone building a house? Anyway, so
what is that? The thumping noise.
Anyway, so it's gonna get worse when my mother calls at 4:00. So in a few minutes, I hope not. Anyway, so so the situation is as such. In the thesis you are talking about specifically, I mean, it is across years. I've read your paper. However, one of the things that is special is that you're talking about undergraduate thesis. Now, in Australia, depending where you sit, the concept of undergraduate thesis has different meanings. So, Australian students, undergraduate students, not all of them write a thesis. However, all students in year 3 and 4 have to undertake a subject which is called classroom research, something like that. So the final assignment will be something like 7,000 words. Assignment 1 might be 2,000 words, just a proposal, and then the final one is about 7,000 words, maybe more. Look, I don't remember. I haven't taught it now in 1.5 years, but give and take, maybe 10,000 words. I don't, for us, it's small, But I think in comparison with your students who are talking about, while you're talking about undergraduate thesis, 7 to 10 or 8 or 10,000 word assignment, it's a large assignment. Then in Australia, we do honors, which is some of us. So I finished honors, Professor Andrew Lyon finished honors because it's a straight path for PhD. So there you do some subjects, but you do a mini thesis, which is now not obligatory, but a part of coursework masters nowadays. Anyway, so my question is, how long is the undergraduate thesis in year 4 for your students? Because we're thinking about workload, because when you say thesis, I think 400 pages. So to give people a bit of a ballpark.
Yeah, it's now quite different, right? Yazid, what happened in our university and also Dr. Anian. A long time ago, we need to write down like chapters, but now we only ask our students to write a thesis article. So a thesis, but in the form of an article for a journal.
Oh, so that's small too, about maximum 10,000 words.
I think so, around 8,000, I believe. Yeah, 8,000. Yeah, nowadays it has shifted from what has happened a long time ago. Yeah.
So Professor Zhu, I can't see things.
Just call her Zuli.
Okay, yeah,
Professor
just call me
Zhu,
Sue.
yeah, thank you. So would you like to add something to our conversation thus far?
Okay, in our context now, I'm in Brawijaya University right now. I think it's almost similar to that in Malang, in UM. We also now allow the students to write not only thesis, but also research article and also research article published in journals and also in what is that? Conferences. So that's possible. And even in other department, it is possible to write books, yeah, instead of article. So, for example, in literature department, then if they publish a book published by good publisher, then they are allowed to use it as to replace the what is that, the necessity for them to write a thesis. So thesis can be replaced by article in journals or maybe article in conferences, and some books can be collections of, if they like to write poems, for example, then it is published and it is also allowed to be used to replace thesis. So that is the practice in our university.
So I found the article very interesting. So one of the things I just pulled out a few quotes from the article, and I would like to maybe ask you some questions about it. I found this one interesting, which is the article or the chapter talks about the past and where you're going. Talks also about reflections and talks about how on the basis of this you want to move forward. So one of the things I found here was our thesis, which is the thesis of those research papers written by students or your own even. They looked like course books. So this one says this one says this one says this one said that, this one said that, this one. A lot of literature reviews continues to look like this in Asia in PhD studies, right? So they're not organized. It is like, a list of texts. Basthomi said this, Anya Lyon said this, Professor Zoli said this one said that, and there's no so what. Why did they say that? What's the difference between them? So instead of presenting frontiers of knowledge in the given area, as noted by Basthomi and Pertiwi. I never knew that Pertiwi published this much, Professor Basthomi, until I read that paper. I was astonished. So that's fantastic. Professor Basthomi, can you tell us more about what has been and where do you think you're going?
Okay. Well, this critical issue in our context, in the Indonesian context particularly. Okay, when we were talking about our experience when we were writing our undergraduate thesis, whatever thesis we wrote at that time. Okay, the point is that at that time we didn't have any orientation towards publication, but recently we've got the pressure from the policy, ministerial policy, that Indonesian academics are supposed to have more publications, and this this brings implications. Like master students are now also expected to have application at the national level, accredited. In nationally accredited journals. But for the doctoral students, they're required to have publication in international journal. One publication actually is enough, and that is in a form of article in international publication for doctoral students. Now, we, I mean, academics, supervisors here in the Indonesian context now are aware of, the need to lead the students towards this orientations towards publication. But to a great extent, what I've observed is that, our students are not really ready for that. And I guess to a great extent, the factor contributing to this unreadiness is the cultural orientation in writing. And the tendency among the students is that, culturally speaking, the strong tendency we've observed is that our students, Indonesian academics in general, tend to write, particularly in the area of EFL, English language, the English language teaching, English language education. We tend to write in a way that it is not that argumentative. For instance, among the students, there is a strong tendency to open their writing by stating, for instance, English is an international language, something like that. If it is about education, some students also write typically something like, education is an intentional attempt to blah, blah, blah. To lead the students, for instance, from
The
knowing
darkness to the light.
nothing. Sorry?
From the darkness to the light.
Right, something like that. So my point here is that typically, the way we write, academics plus the students, or the students' way endorsed by the academics, the supervisors, is that we tend to provide definitions, which actually many scholars have been familiar with. So there's a kind of repetition of what we have been familiar with, and that is the typical way of how we write. So what I'm thinking is that the argumentativeness is not there, because we tend to write definitions, and writing definitions in my observation is like writing a book or course book, if the course book is intended for instance, undergraduate students, because we can assume that the undergraduate students are not that familiar with particular issues as represented in the definitions, so that we need to provide definitions. So I guess that is the main feature of like course book. But in writing, say, research reports like articles, I guess the orientations is toward argumentation. We need to argue why we need to carry out this particular research, for instance. But then we are not accustomed to this kind of orientations for argumentation, even though, just like in our department, for instance, we've provided a course, writing course on argumentation, actually, for our undergraduate students. Even so, there is a strong tendency among us that we write like a course book by providing definitions and definitions and definitions. And culturally speaking, probably we can say that, okay, the readers will be able to, what do you call, infer our argumentation by reading our definitions. So we've got the tendency towards that. What do you call that? Reader responsible type of writing, not writer responsible type of writing. So culturally
Right. So you
speaking,
want, so
this
they
is what
want to make the reader to do the work. They don't want to do the
right,
work for the
right.
reader. And that's an important clue that all people who are watching us should remember, because I see it in my own doctoral students. Forget about the undergraduates. I teach at master level and the postgraduate level, any level. You do the work for the reader. The reader should be relaxed and learning from you, not stretching, because the examiner is gonna read and he's gonna hate you. The last thing you want is to have the examiner against you. I might just ask you something else, because we're talking about definitions and that sort of culture. So you talked about what was the other one? So we talked about the course books, so definition course book, and now I would like to sort of come back to the next sort of stage of uh, of the chapter and also our discussion, which is the sentence: novelty has to do with research or knowledge gap identification. We will all agree this is a hard job. Now, all of us are thinking about it possibly for different reasons. It's hard, but it is hard. However we look at it, it's hard. So, yeah, novelty has to do with research and knowledge gap identification. So, whom did I ask? Dr. Zuli, how do
Uh,
you help students identify, generate novelty?
yeah, usually it's very difficult for students, if even for us, for me, sometimes it's very difficult. So I'd like to, usually uh, I try to ask the students what is the focus of their research, and then I try to help them find relevant review of literature. Yeah, usually I use the open source first, like open knowledge maps, and then I help them to use connected papers, for example. Then by using those two applications, then they can come up with relevant um, research to review. Um, and then some of the research are not open access. Then if it is not open access, usually I ask them to use ProQuest or Science Direct then to get the article needed. And then after that, I ask them to make a kind of synthesis or summary of each of the article. And then after that, we try to understand what is the direction of each of the article. Is the article support another article? Is it different things and things like that? But it's very often the students find it very difficult to link between one article and the other article, especially if they have to come to kind of negative review. I mean, they usually do what is called positive review. They can say that this is the result of this article, blah, 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 the result of this research, and the contribution of this research is this. But then when they come to the point of evaluating what is the weaknesses of the research or what is the missing link in that area, what is the gap, then it is difficult. Sometimes they do not have any courage, especially because maybe because they feel that, oh, I'm still undergraduate student. So what is the power of me to identify what is wrong or what is missing or what is lacking from the other research? So maybe that's kind of feeling exists over there, and maybe also it relates to our culture of being afraid of being different. Usually we often agree with one another to criticize or to review it and to be different from others is not easy in our culture. So maybe it's because of culture too.
So, so if we look at this particular slide, Professor Basthomi, you've been with us when we were reading Thomas. What is your comment, which is about the culture of agreeing, right? So what Tom and some of you quoted in your chapter this particular text. So Thomas, which is who's a professor, Greg Thomas or Gary Thomas? Gary Thomas, sorry.
Gary Thomas, yeah.
Yes. So he said he's a professor from of education in University of Sussex. So and also had been an editor of key journals in education. So it is not just anybody who said that. So most advance in thought and practice comes not from paying due regard to what is established, from conforming to correct procedure. It comes from the dismissal of that existing thought, from rapture rather than conformity. I think this needs to be. What do you think about this quote, Professor Yazid?
Yeah, well, I agree with this, and I guess this resonates the idea of what do you call that? You know, the book by Thomas Kuhn, right? The Revolution of what do you call that? I don't remember exactly the title. The structure of
Yes,
scientific revolution, something like that.
I was
Yeah,
thinking of Popper.
Thomas
What
Kuhn. I
about
guess I
Kuhn?
agree with that.
The
I
paradigms
guess the
guy.
statement by say it again.
The Kuhn was the person of paradigms, right?
Yeah, but I guess the one published in about 1975, I guess that is about the structure of revolution or scientific structure. Said,
Yes,
I
scientific
don't know.
revolution.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
scientific revolution.
the structure of
And
scientific revolutions.
yeah, I guess that is about what do you call one of the points there is that you know scientific revolution is always about what do you call being different from what has been in existence, and I guess that is not, I would say, not part of our culture. I mean, from the Indonesian point of view that I've observed, that is not in our culture. So I think we need to work hard towards this orientation. And okay, going back to your previous point, previous quote about gap. Well, just like what we've mentioned in the book chapter, well, we've observed that recently supervisors, thesis examiners have been aware of the need to deal with research gap or knowledge gap. Many of them have started to question that to the students defending the thesis. But then, to a great extent, there is still a tendency that if the students are successful in reviewing critically previous studies to contextualize his or her topic against the backdrop of the existing body of knowledge as represented by previous studies, a critical point is that uh, quite a number of them are still in failure. I mean, they still fail to, what do you call? The tendency is that they make a jump, if not a leap. For instance, after showing the difference or showing that the topic that I'm dealing with is different from the existing previous studies, then that point becomes the reason why they carry out this research. And I guess this is a kind of jump because
Okay,
we
so
can see.
I
Uh,
didn't really understand. So, do you expect the student to make the jump, or because
no, no. The tendency is that the students make a jump. And probably this kind of jump has also been endorsed by the supervisors or examiners. But actually, I still observe there is something missing there. because we need to, think about the possible implications of the gap. If the students are successful in identifying a gap, there is a tendency they will jump, right? That is my point. And I don't think that that is a good way. So that's why we wrote this book chapter particularly. The point is that and I've tried to make my students aware of this. And usually my question is like this: if you've been able to identify a gap, then do you think the only implication of the gap is the research that you are proposing?
Yeah, I
By
understand.
having
That's
this
the next
question,
question. Yes, I have that on
right?
my slide too. Yeah, about
So
implications.
by having this
Yeah,
question, usually I start to make the students aware that carrying out this research is not the only implication.
right,
Because
because students tend to think that once they got something really exciting, then they have the answer to everybody's problems.
yes, exactly. So
That's positive thinking. Um, Regarding the gap, which is something that I really want to continue, even though I will be showing you some other slides and I will introduce shortly Andrew and Lala into the discussion, but I just want information out of you first so that we all understand the context here. I've been, I have pretty long history in mentoring at different levels in different courses. In fact, just recently, a person that I mentored to become a lecturer just got her first lectureship. She's very young. She got there, and I'm still waiting for the keys. Thank you, keys. Haven't seen her yet. Anyway, so there are different ways. There are different ways in supervising students, and sometimes a study may begin with some interest, even equivalent to your undergraduate or undergraduate, have an interest. But do you have particular techniques to assist students in identifying the gap? Or maybe sometimes your students can actually partake in your research project and be your research assistants. We had this coursework masters for a few years running in our college, whereby we actually used our master students to do literature review, to do research, and then someone like me integrated that work into publishing. So their assignments were not good enough to be published, but when the mentor twisted and turned them and added their own take on things, then it happens. So, do you have some specific techniques that you developed as mentors for assisting students in identifying the gap?
Excuse me, let me try to answer, especially in my practice. What I did is that I give them an example of an article or a thesis containing gaps, and then uh, and first of all, I'd like to give them time to try which one is the gap. But then, usually in the first try, they cannot identify it. But then after that, I'll show them examples of keywords that can become gap identification. And I usually also show them another article with gap identification. Usually in the second try, usually they will be able to do that. So I give them another thesis or another article where they can identify gaps with different expressions, with different use of wordings. That is what I usually do in the classrooms.
So, if we look at this comment here, so we have a text from the student. From the explanation above, it can be seen that there are not many studies about metaphors that focus on visual metaphors. Because of that reason, the writer decided to conduct a study about metaphors that concern visual metaphors. So Dr. Zuli, what do you think of this particular text? And then we have a comment. So we have a comment so basically, I suspect that that's a lecturer's comment. In your background, before you describe and analyze the previous research, provide adequate explanation about metaphors and visual metaphors, as well as the importance of analyzing metaphors in the movie. So tell us, what are metaphors? What are visual metaphors? That actually calls for definitions, Professor Basthomi. I'm sorry, but that's the comment asking me for definitions. Or am I wrong?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So I guess our comments, I mean, this comment, I guess to some extent would be misleading in a way. But I guess in the following step of consultation, what we need to do, I guess, is to, to adjust this comment to mean that, in the review of relevant previous studies, I guess the students need to make sure that they review uh, points which are the research variables. Which are the research variables? I mean, what I mean is this: if the students indicate particular research variables in the title, then they need to review relevant previous studies having to do with those variables, not necessarily about the definition of what is meant by metaphor, what is meant by visual metaphor. I guess that is the continuation. I mean, in the consultation process. So now I can see it that it might be misleading in a way because
Right.
this kind of comment tends to lead the students to provide definitions.
Professor Mick, where did the student get that first sentence from? How did the student generate it?
You mean from the explanation above, that one, that first sentence?
Yeah. How
Okay.
did the student create that?
Yeah, this one is actually, this is part of an introductory paragraph. So they have provided some explanation, and then in the middle they provide from the explanation above. But then actually the explanation itself do not provide explanation of what research has been done on metaphor, and also some ideas about visual metaphor itself. It happens so many times actually, Dr. Ania. Perhaps not only this example. So students usually talk about, like the teaching of listening or the teaching of reading. So they would provide description of reading is, or the teaching of reading is important in Indonesia. And then they said, like, from the explanation above, something like that. But then they just provide like explanation of the teaching of reading, but not exactly what research has been done on that particular field. So say they are talking about extensive reading, so they would talk about that. They do not talk about what research has been done on extensive reading, for example. But they only talk about what they know about, and what they feel about that, but not based on research. That's what I understand. So that is why they have that kind of sentence from the explanation above.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah.
No, this is not about wrong. This is for us to share our experiences, because the idea is for us all to understand context of each other. So now I'm gonna put Dr. Lala on the spot. He's been my student He's been through the horrible process.
Yeah.
When I was writing my PhD, I hardly had any support, so I had to work out a lot of things for
Yeah.
myself. And yes, I developed a lot of processes. And then I, did horrible things to my doctoral students. I used to say, if I press that button, the definition has to come out from your mouth when you
Yeah.
speak. And the
Right.
best
Right.
person who succeeded at it was Wahid Nasruddin. You press the button, any explanation of anything. So, Lala, what is your
Yeah.
take on this paragraph of a student?
I think this is a very common comment made by so many people. I think in the past I also made the same comment on my students' work, and I stopped doing that actually because
I'm not
you
talking about
know
the commentary by the lecturer. I just would like you to look at the student, which is that sentence above, and let me
yeah.
know what would you have done for that to never happen.
Well, actually, I would ask the students to connect the ideas of metaphor with a bigger picture, I guess. So that's actually one thing. I was able to learn how to identify the gap. I think when I was doing my PhD with you and Andrew, because in some, I don't know, my background in linguistics, for instance, have not allowed me to identify the gap, right? So maybe I was doing the learning in a wrong way because I failed to connect linguistics with other subdisciplines. But actually, now we have interdisciplinary linguistic, I guess, when we could actually connect one single discipline with another. So by focusing on more than one keyword or three or probably more than 20 keywords, we could actually not define, but connect the concepts. And once they are able to connect let's say, the core concept of metaphor, then they could actually see the gap. But actually, that's not the final end to it. I mean, in order to see the gap, we have to go back to the previous questions. I mean, the research questions that are proposed by the students. We also have to look at the mechanism of how the student actually put the literature review in context. So there's actually a very long process of identifying the gap in one single work. And then what I'm doing here in my department is um, I need to see my students on regular basis, 3 times a week, on workshop setup, not traditional one-to-one basis anymore, because we have to see the gap together. My students coming to me with various ideas in TESOL area. They come to me with story science and literacy, and some of them are working on verbotenal approach. So without any consistency and intensity in supervision, I don't think that I could actually locate and identify the whole picture. So when my students are doing this, I will keep it for a record, but we will go back in next week and next month, and then we will ask ourselves whether or not the gap is already there. Because in order to see the real gap, we have to jump from one discipline to another discipline, and I think that's it takes a lot of courage, Anya, to learn something beyond the discipline. In the TESOL world, I guess there is a sense that we lack interdisciplinary view. I know that TESOL is interdisciplinary discipline, but in many departments of English or English language teaching, for instance, I feel that we don't talk much about interdisciplinary view of research itself. So we will get stuck in the same research questions, same methodology, and then we have a time constraint. We have to finish the research project in 3 months here in my university, but the whole process of research could actually go back a year before. So I have like a year with my students to start talking about the research ideas, and then we will have to address the gap from day one until the final day of their research presentation. So that's actually the first thing I do, and the second thing I do is I I now actually embrace reading for emotion as a tool for research. So the workshop of research that I'm doing with my students are using this reading for emotion stuff, where my students in the first week or the first month of research supervision will be focused on talking about, let's say, the focus and disturbance, where they can actually use the open data, right? The open data from UNESCO, for instance. I think it will help them a lot in identifying the gap. So from my note here, actually, it's very interesting when I can use reading for emotions in my class. The open data will say like this. PISA shows that Indonesian students are performing some 3 years behind the OECD average. That's actually mentioned by OECD document in 2015. If there is a research saying that we are now having better literacy, so now we are confronted by two conflicting evidence, right? So I think that's the very basic idea of the workshop of research that I'm doing with my students. And my other student will come to me. Over 50% of Indonesian 15-year-olds do not master basic skills in reading or mathematics, for instance. And then that's also found in OECD document in 2015. And then what is it? Less than 1% of adults in Jakarta attain the highest level of proficiency, level 4 or 5 in literacy. What does it actually mean? How are they related to research and blah, blah, blah. So I think by encouraging them to look at the open data on the internet, they could actually find disturbance, and then they go to the right context of the gap. So that's what I've been doing.
All right. So
Yeah.
So if I can summarize what you meant was. I didn't want to summarize. I was hoping you wouldn't say that. I hope that you forgot about the whole thing, but you didn't forget because in the last moment you said that. So what's missing here is a problem.
Right. A problem
so
is missing.
Disturbance because it's from my model.
Right.
But so that's why the comment by the lecture is also lost.
Yep.
Because the lecture is trying to say what the heck are we talking here about, right? So the lecture, so what you're saying is that you have a particular method that you learned from me, and that enables students to sequence first maybe as a really dirty draft, but then you polish it and polish, right? So but basically you focus them on the problem. Because like your daughter said to me, Anya, how come the recipe has a problem? Clearly has a problem, right?
Yes, that's the
question.
Yes.
It has a moral too. If you want your cake to look like this one on the picture, you better do what I do. All right, so problem is missing. I think that, so what happens here is that I have a little bit different style of supervision than Andrew. So we will listen to Andrew. What Andrew would do if a student produced undergraduate students. So it's not your doctoral student who is, the top guy or girl, trained in being focused. So Andrew, if your fourth year student produces a sentence like this, we use my method, we just do whatever with Lala, but what would you do? Because I know you do different things. You would let them go with it. Or what would you do? You would say APL doesn't understand.
Well, you see, you've all been talking about gaps. I actually don't know what a gap is. Because for me, the gap is assuming that there is a construction, that the construction is more or less correct, and that we find holes in it and we close the gap. We call it a gap. We close the hole and we make the construction better. But actually, in much of the work that I do, I actually question the wall. Is the wall okay? Or should we be thinking in different ways? And it seems to me that the field of TESOL is fairly stagnant. As Lala said, we keep going round in circles. And why do we keep going round in circles? Because we ask basically the same questions. We do not undermine, we are not subversive. We are not saying, let's try something completely different, and ask ourselves where the focus is. Now, a lot of times the focus is actually language, And we come to this work from language and we approach it through linguistics. But when we talk about language education, or we talk about language learning, our job is not to teach language. I mean, is not to teach the mechanics of language. It is to help people learn language.
Yeah.
At least that's how I see my job, and that's how I think a lot of other people see their jobs. We are in language education. So how do we get people how do we facilitate the learning of language by people? And it's not through
Okay,
linguistics.
There's another question, Andrew. What does it mean to use language? Right? So we go back. So tracing back. Sometimes in our courses, the younger
the trouble is we think we know what language is. And we think we know what language is because we've categorized things and it's comfortable. We are familiar with these categories. In the old days when I studied linguistics, and I'm a lot older than all of you, we used to study Saussure, first of all. We used to study the theory of the sign. We used to study Peirce. And so we spent a lot of time defining what kind of linguistics we are teaching. Now we tend not to do that anymore. It all died with Chomsky. It all died with Chomsky. After Chomsky, linguistics became either Chomsky or something a bit vaguer. For me, linguistics is great, but it doesn't count in terms of learning. The focus should not be linguistics. The focus should be pedagogy. The focus should be, if you like, not pedagogy, because pedagogy is a kind of negative term, should be learning. How do we facilitate the learning of something, which in this case happens to be language?
Yes, Andrew, but you had a literature student, or literature or linguistics students, or whatever, semiotics student, culture student, and who says, I'm going to do metaphors, there's not enough on metaphors, so therefore I will do metaphors.
Okay. And why do I care about that? Why do I care about that?
So that's Andrew's. Andrew has actually taught me the best.
That's not necessarily Andrew's answer. I'm not denying the existence of metaphors, and I'm not denying the value of studying about metaphors.
But what would you answer to the student when he comes to you with that
I don't understand the question. The student is saying, well, I think we should do more about metaphors. My question would be the same as everybody else's question. Well, why should I do that anyway? I mean, what's the point of it? And if the student can demonstrate to me that there is not enough evidence about the different kinds of metaphors that are relevant, then okay, go ahead and do it. But as everybody said before, we need a problem. I mean, the problem has to determine the extent of the research study. I actually wanted to say a couple of other things, so I'm going to say them because time's running out. The first thing I wanted to say is we in our field, the so-called field of TESOL, which I don't believe actually exists. I think it's an artificiality. If it's anything, it's language learning in general, including English, which I suppose makes it TESOL, is that we tend not to rock the boat. We tend to be very, we're not very subversive. We're afraid to be subversive. We tend to want to have everything referenced backwards. So, if everything has to be justified by looking into the past, it's very difficult to move into the future. And so we tend to work within the dogma, and we tend to reinforce the dogma of TESOL. And the dogma of TESOL tends to be about classrooms. It tends to be about language. For example, just to take two examples, right? Nobody says, let's throw classrooms out. Anyone want to do that, Reese, here? I would.
No, I don't. I mean, Andrew, classrooms
you see,
are important.
Anya doesn't like that because it's too subversive.
I mean, we learn languages in many different ways, but classrooms have their place too.
I didn't say classrooms didn't have their place. I don't want the only place to be classrooms, and I don't want the classroom to be assumed as the locus of learning, as the first place of learning. It may be seen as part of a resource which is available, And it doesn't have to be a classroom, it can be groupings. Groupings are not necessarily classrooms. Classrooms don't have to have a syllabus. They don't have to have a particular lesson plan. As we've said in previous meetings, how many words are you going to teach them today? 10? Oh, very good. And how many words do you think they will remember at the end of the week? Maybe 5? So, and if so, so what? I was just listening to David Crystal yesterday talking about English, and he has a jaundiced view of education, actually. He says, well, sorry, I shouldn't try to imitate David Crystal, but David Crystal was saying, well, after all, there's only 44 sounds in English. They're not hard. You should be able to control them pretty well quickly, enough to be intelligible, which of course is a misunderstanding of how language perception works and about how pronunciation learning works. But anyway, the fact is that even if it's only a miserable 44 sounds, lots of people are not intelligible at all with those 44 sounds. He then went on to say, oh, well, there must be about 3,000 grammar rules. Well, that's not too bad. In 4 or 5 years, you can control all of those. I'm glad to hear that, because I'd like to see what he's done with his Spanish. Or his French, or whatever it is. And apart from the fact that he was saying things like, "Oh, I don't care if I have an accent because I'm foreign and I'm proud of being foreign." Well, the point, of course, is he says, "I want to be me." He wants to be him in. I mean, imagine if he wants to be him in Indonesian, for example. Well, what's he going to sound like? A child? Is he going to be the him who is the professor and authority on English language? Or is it going to be somebody who is like a child? Is that being him? Anyway, that's just a small criticism. What he's saying is the real core of the problem is vocabulary. Vocabulary has 1 million words in English. Well, he said 1 million. I tried to check today, and it varies from 170,000 to 600,000 to 1 million. So he says it's 1 million. So what are we going to teach our students? The 1 million words? No, of course not. Are we going to teach them the most frequent 2,000 words? Well, maybe. And is that going to make them able to function in any environment? No, of course it isn't. Because 2,000 words just doesn't get it, doesn't make you functional in specific fields. So you have to extend those notions, and they're all more dynamic than we tend to think. So the reason I mentioned that is because of the general criticism I make in terms of the approaches that we use in our TESOL programs, which is we have classrooms, we have lesson plans, they have to be approved by the administration, and so on. And at the end of the people who, oops, is anybody still there? You all disappeared.
Yeah. We're here.
And at the, okay, I think you're all back.
And at
the end of the day, people like you who are perfectly fluent in English at C2 level on the CEFR scales, learn it not from your classes and your lesson plans, but from some other mysterious interconnection with English. Engagement, certainly.
To build on Andrew, I think one of
yes.
I get PhD students from all over the place, and one of my doctoral students knew everything how to teach English, and she told me I had no idea what I was talking about. It was all good. And yes, it was Hanum, I have to say. It was Hanum. I love that feisty spirit.
But she changed a bit.
Because she read one article, and this is something about talking about the gap. By the time she changed her mind, was not, I try to explain, but you can't explain to someone who cannot understand, right? So I gave her the article by Donald Hoffman, which is, we don't see reality as it is, but as evolution enables us to see. So she read about experiments sorry for this, because the only experiment I can think of is about the beetle, Australian beetle almost dying in Australia because Australians were making beer bottles of the same shiny brown. In fact, the shiny brown color of the beer bottle looked better than the female beetle. So the male beetle started mating with the beer bottles because they were better looking girls. And consequently, as we were losing our beetles, they had to change the bottles in Australia, because when Australians were drinking bottle, they would throw it, especially in the desert or somewhere, and beetles just thought they were better looking girls. So I think that sort of took her on the journey of looking for amazing evidence, which is articulated by the researcher in a very accessible way. And now I think we can explore with the students, what the heck do you think does it mean? And kids, I mean, they year 3, year 4, this is not like the professors, right? They're not going to lose a career on the basis of this little paper. And it would be interesting to work with them, the paper, the imagination of consequences, and how can we get them with research skills so that they polish their research skills. And that's what made a difference when she realized that evolution adapted us not to see scrambled light, which is what our retina sees, but to get the brain make up stuff here and say, well, I'm seeing the screen. There's a lot of wonderful research. I had 2 good friends in Canberra. I've given them I've done this experiment everywhere with my students too, where you can see that people who are passing basketball ball to each other. So they watch these people passing the ball to each other, and in the middle comes a gorilla. But because they are focused on counting how which had white shirts, they don't see the gorilla. It's you don't believe me, right? It is unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. You've got to be autistic to see the gorilla or something. You know, like maybe every time I have like 21 students, maybe 1 student will see the gorilla. The rest of them don't. So these amazing things are questioning the relationship between the culture, not just evolution, but your culture, the networks that inform you the way how you comprehend. So changing the culture of a student may not necessarily begin with pushing them, but by inspiring them, surprising them. Something like that could happen. Now, it's now difficult on you now because you have no idea what to do with it either. It's okay. It's only 3rd, 4th year study. It's, as I said, it's not atom bomb creating or something. I wanted to show you quickly something that something tells me it's too much for today, but I can't help myself. So being an enthusiastic person. So you will all recognize the ChatGPT thing, but this is an address that I want you to explore. You can upload there your article, PDF, which I did. Now, I wouldn't have explored this version, right? It wouldn't occur to me. However, the person that I admire wrote this paper with other people, and it is, I swear to you, look how thick it is. I've read it, but it was a long time ago. I forgot it. And now I would have to read this paper again. It's like 40 pages. It's crazy. So I asked ChatGPT to tell me what it is about. First, it said, so you upload it, and then it shows you questions that you could ask of it about it. So I didn't do all of it. It's not on this. I could take another time, another session, right? But basically, it gave me questions. Then I asked those questions. Then I asked other questions of the questions that were posed, and other questions, and other questions. And as I was editing my doctoral student's thesis, I took the text from here and I shoved it there because it says it better than the student said, and it's just beautiful. It just interrogates, so it summarizes, so you can ask it to summarize, to create a long summary, short summary. You can interact with those questions they suggest that you could ask, And then you ask questions of the questions of the question, and you can actually have an informed way of interacting with the text that may confirm or challenge your first reading. I don't assume that your students will be reading articles like this one. I swear to you, she overdid here with those 40 pages. But think about whether you would use these things. So it's something for you to consider. I am absolutely, personally, I can't help myself. I'm a total supporter of ChatGPT. It will change some things we do. Maybe your students will produce fabulous English, but then you can talk to them, examine them on their work. So what they will have to do is to turn those words into their concepts so that they can have a discussion with you, and you can examine them on the paper and on the discussion. So it's your imagination now, but that was just quite interesting. Talking about the abstract, I had just the other day a student completely lost, and someone else didn't know how to help them, and there was some sort of confusion. Anyway, he came to me and I said, okay, we do abstract, to know what he wanted to do. And he said, no, abstract is at the end. I said, friend, final abstract is at the end. First abstract is at the beginning, which to tell us what we're actually doing. So we wrote a very rough draft, not this. This is just ChatGPT's. So we wrote this abstract, so the first sentence is probably the focus, which is the systemic functional linguistics is orientation. I don't like that term. I like my own terms, but basically it's introducing you to grab the attention. Then you can see the despite in the paragraph, so it's a problem statement. So I pushed him to actually say what he wanted to say. The problem was that the people for whom he was doing research, they didn't know what's the problem because they don't have enough training. He didn't know what's the problem. I've never participated in those conversations, but I've worked out very quickly what the problem was. So there we go. We got the abstract really rough. I didn't post it here because I don't even have a file anymore where the draft was. We posted it or pasted it in ChatGPT. It produced this beautiful text. It went into his proposal. And then he goes, we need the title. We had the rough title, but I said, friend, I don't trust myself. We took the rough title. No, we didn't take the rough title. I said to ChatGPT, based on the abstract, can you please generate the title? So it did. It's fantastic. The problem is that an institution produces academic support for students, but can't evaluate its support systems because students do not offer feedback. So that's why we have the title, Measuring Success in Silence. Now you tell me with your hand on your heart, would you come up with a title like that? Never. I can bet everything I own. It's so hard. It's so poetic. Maybe some of you teach poetry, but it's so poetic, right? Just did it. So then, as we were going through the proposal, he goes, research question. I said, friend, one of the qualities I have, and Andrew is here to testify, I can't produce good research questions. I kind of know where we're going, but my research questions always look pedestrian. Always. I run them always past Andrew. So I went to ChatGPT and I said, based on the abstract, what research questions would you suggest? And it came up with research questions. Was that cheating or was that support? My students started to get worried and I said, friend, you would have produced something, I would have edited that, corrected it. Would that have been a plagiarism? When you use my feedback, when you use my corrections, is that plagiarism? It was a help. It was teaching us. It was then teaching us how to integrate. Well, it didn't teach us. We were then thinking how to integrate those research questions in the structure of the research paper. It generated 6 research questions. For this level, I wouldn't create 6 questions. I would have created maximum 2. But because it created 6, the first 3 or 4 I can't recall, we used as maybe I have a next slide here. So we had a problem statement, which we copied, and 6 research questions. I think the first 3 or 4 we used for literature review or whatever, and then I think the last one was for recommendations to guide our thinking. So the trick was you still had to understand those research questions, you still had to relate them to the structure of your writing, but it's a help. When you are 60, you probably will not need much of it. But when you are 16 or 20, it's a lot of help, especially if English is not your first language, right? So now the focus is on working with the support of ChatGPT rather than calling it whatever, right? So it's a support. It's like a dictionary. It's like Google, but better. So you can talk to it, it can help you and so on. So, okay, so that's practically what I wanted to share with you as something for you to reflect. Because then you could have this sentence about metaphors. And rather than struggle with the student to make them understand, do the autonomous learning. Put them in front of ChatGPT. ChatGPT will say, sorry, I don't understand. Are you interested in this? Or are you interested in this? Are you interested in that? And now they have to read it, they have to understand, they have to interact. How much thinking is happening? So rather than you spending 2 hours on one little paragraph that the student doesn't even know why they did it badly. So I don't know. Look, it's very new. I'm thinking myself about how to use. I'm using it immensely now, immensely, as you could see with that paper by Imordino Young and her colleagues, in many different ways. So, what do you guys think? I mean, we have to close now. We're past 1 hour, but your first impression?
Can I say something, Dr. Anik? ChatGPT is quite helpful, actually. Yes, I would agree with that. However, we haven't got any kind of, what is that, regulation in our university. We are not yet there. It might be quite challenging. I mean, some of my students might already know that, some other may not, and we also haven't got any regulation in our university. But yes, I think it would be quite interesting to
I
help.
think I also feel I don't know, Professor Basthomi, how do you feel about it? Cambodia doesn't have access to it. Some other countries have no access to it. Now, when you saw the title, something about silence, measuring success in silence, now you're learning about how to produce titles which are poetic, your vocabulary, your forms of interaction, engaging in an effective way, the range of possible phrases is expanding. I mean, now expanded mind. What do you think, Professor?
Well, that is interesting. And personally, I would be towards that, direction actually. My colleagues usually would comment, well, if your title is such, usually Pak Yazid is not happy because Pak Yazid usually asks the students to have sexy title. And I would say this example typifies a sexy title. But of course, the implication is that the students, the writers, need to be able to back up with the argument why the title is such, right? But personally, I usually would have that kind of orientation, asking the students to have quote unquote sexy title. If it is poetic, I would say it tends to be sexy.
I don't know, Andrew. You have experience just
But it's not
way
a
more
question. It's not a question. No, no. It's not a question of having a sexy title or not having a sexy title. The point is, there are 2 points. The first thing is that ChatGPT actually exists. That's the strength of ChatGPT. The fact that it actually exists and understands you more or less naturally. That's not bad. And we haven't asked them how they fix the comprehension problem. It might actually be of value to us as in our teaching area. The second thing is that it enables, it's going away. Okay, it's come back. It enables a dialogue to happen between the learner and somebody, and creates the opportunity for what in computing terms might be called a precision dialogue. You have a conversation with, no, I didn't mean this, I meant something else. What about something else? And so you finish up, if you believe in dialogic pedagogy, if you believe in Michael Bakhtin, if you believe in Eugene Matusov in Delaware, all of these guys, all of these people involved in dialogue and in interaction, I mean, this enables it to happen. Now, I know I'm talking as an idealist in cultures which try to cheat, which I mean, in Thailand, a lot of people try to cheat in terms of handing in essays and assignments to their teachers and say, oh, I wrote this, and the teacher has to go and check it. I think Yazid has a very good point in that we have to, and Anya also, we have to go and check with the student. We cannot rely on the writings that are presented to us as indicating control over the topic that they are talking about. Nevertheless, it does enable us to have a polished text which makes sense and which we can use as a reference point to discuss things with students. So assessment is going to become much more important than it has been in the past. You're not just going to be able to take the essays home and give them a grade, right? You're going to have to probe into the student's head somehow. And I think that's one of the points. On the other hand, it gives you these opportunities which we never had before, and dialogic pedagogy is one of them. And we just keep thinking that it's just going to create the thesis for us or the article for us. Well, it's not going to do that. It can't.
It's not going to do that. Try, ask it about any subject, and it's going to produce very generic language, very boring, nothing to it. With that student, I showed you that we did the abstract and the research. We asked it also for references. It was old and boring, and the student called me. He said they don't work, and I said it's okay. It's not. You can do the rest. We've done a lot of work. So I had a 1 hour session, and he's now on his way doing the rest of what's needed. But it's ChatGPT doesn't do the work for you. Also, your students will be writing something that is has a problem, is focused, and ChatGPT doesn't. It solves some problems but doesn't know everything, right? And there's uniqueness. There's a uniqueness.
In fact, it knows very little. If you were to ask it to write an essay about verbotonalism, which is one of the areas that I work in, it wouldn't have a clue.
Yeah, about
Zero.
SFL, it produced 6 short paragraphs, like 2-liners, and it was just like run of the mill, and so on. So it's not really like that. Yeah, but it also helps us to think of assessment differently as well, and I think it's great because it enables students who are working very hard with ChatGPT, interacting with it. Then that puts the next layer, which is make use out of it in some, not only just by working with those concepts and putting them on paper and whatever, but also repeat it. See how much you can retain from that vocabulary. Can you now make a presentation? So, and that's what we want from third year and the fourth year. We want them to be able to talk professionally rather than just use very, words like put, take, get. It was all good. It was very nice. So I don't know, friends, something to play with.
Well, it'd be nice if some of my students could do that, actually. Okay.
Do what?
Regrettably, I have to disappear very shortly.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Yazid, Professor Andrew, Anik, and Zuli. Thank you so much, and Lala. And We have other people here online. Sadly, I couldn't put them all on their window because it was just, cluttering the window, so I couldn't let them in. So thank you so much for the discussion. It was very interesting. We raised a lot of things, and good that we're all working towards making our own work as mentors better and better. Our students think of us as geniuses, that we know it all, but we don't. We work as hard with student today as we worked with a student 20 years ago. I mean, Andrew, when I was showing him my PhD, Andrew, who was a professor, already had one PhD student behind him. Andrew knows. Look at his face. He says, I had no idea what you were writing about. That was the help I got from my husband. So my supervisor was a linguist, had no idea about pedagogy. I was stuck. So it's not, nobody is a genius here. Every student is another challenge. Every student is another problem. So I think that unfortunately our students would like to know that we sort of, but no, we're human beings. We're human beings, unfortunately. God is God and the rest of us is not.
Okay,
All right, thank you so
for
much.
having us. Yeah,
Thank you for having us.
thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.